Guys, well, I want to introduce you to our next guest. You really got to get a blessing out of this. This is going to also be a tremendous way to empower you and equip you as you share with a lost world. He's here to provide you with tactics for defending your faith. His work is in training Christians about the most controversial issues of our day, such as evolution, abortion, relativism, homosexuality, euthanasia, cloning, and Islam. I mean, wouldn't you want to be able to communicate that, especially to unbelievers, in a way that they train that is winsome and friendly and loving and inviting, and that's what his ministry specializes in. So ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome now to the stage Alan Shlemon.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. My parents were born in Baghdad, Iraq, and they were raised there in that country along with my brother and many of my relatives. However, they were not raised as Muslims. And the reason is because my people, all of my parents, my family, all my extended relatives, are what's known as Assyrians. Now, this is not to be confused with Syrians, which are people from Syria, which is a country that exists today, but rather Assyria is another people group that hasn't had really a nation for over 2,700 years. In fact, just out of curiosity, raise your hands if you've ever heard of the Assyrian people. It looks like most of you have. If you're familiar with your Old Testament history, you'll recall the Assyrians are actually talked a lot about in the Old Testament. Unfortunately for me, they were the sworn enemies of Israel, and consequently, well, we were the sworn enemies of God. So that was kind of a bummer. But it was interesting because I remember when I was a kid, my parents would take this kind of negative fact and try to spin it in a positive way. I mean, it was never effective, but they would come up to me, and I was a little kid, and they would come up to me and say, "Hey, guess what, little Alan? Guess what? Our people are talked about in the Bible. But you know what? We're the bad guys, And so with a lot of therapy and counseling, you get over the emotional turmoil of knowing God doesn't love you and have a wonderful plan for your people. But no, actually he does. But fortunately, even though the Assyrian Empire was destroyed in about 700 BC, some of them survived. And then, long story short, my parents were born, and hence I'm here. But enough about my problems. Let's talk about the question of how to persuasively yet graciously share your convictions and defend your convictions with regards to your faith in Jesus Christ. Many years ago, before I was in this line of work, I was working as a physical therapist in East LA. There's a hospital called LA County USC Medical Center. And, got a couple fans here, all right. or former employees or employees, yes, okay. So when I was there, I was working as a physical therapist, and one of my friends, who was a colleague of mine, asked me out to lunch. So I said, sure, let's go out to lunch. He was a Hindu, and so we sat down to have some good fish tacos in this kind of like no-name place down there in East LA. And he proceeded to tell me that he was going to be getting married. And I said, oh, wonderful, Raj. His name was Raj. I said, congratulations. And so I asked him a question. I said, Raj, are you going to have a Hindu wedding or an American wedding? So I kind of wanted to know to what degree is he bringing his culture over to the United States. And he said, yeah, I'm going to have a Hindu wedding. I said, oh, that's wonderful. So I asked him another question. I said, Raj, is Hinduism something that's important to you? He thought about it for a moment. He's like, yeah, Hinduism is important to me. I said, oh, that's great. So I asked him another question. I said, Raj, do you believe Hinduism is true? Thought about it for just a little bit longer. He said, yeah, I think Hinduism is true. I said, oh, great. So I asked him another question. I said, Raj, do you think all religions are true? Like not just Hinduism, but Buddhism and Islam and Christianity and Judaism. And he thought about it for a moment, and he finally said, yeah, I think they're pretty much all about the same. Now, at this point in the conversation, I came to realize that my friend Raj is what's known as a religious pluralist. Now, obviously, he didn't use that term, but this is basically the idea that you think all religions are true, you can't say any one religion is false, or any one religion is more true than another. Now, as a follower of Jesus Christ, those were not my convictions. And so I wanted to encourage my friend to abandon this idea or approach towards religions. So I asked him one final question. I said, Raj, what would you think about a religion that taught that its deity is God, was a physical being that was the size of a football field, that hovered on the far side of the moon all the time, and was responsible for controlling the weather patterns on our planet? I said, what would you think about a religion that taught that? He thought about it for a moment, then he began to smile. He goes, well, yeah, I guess I wouldn't believe that religion's also true. He goes, okay, I take it back. I don't think all religions are true, just the ones that kind of make sense. And so then he backed away from his initial claim towards religious pluralism. Now notice what I didn't do in that conversation. I didn't tell him he was wrong. I didn't tell him religious pluralism is false. In fact, I didn't even defend any aspect of my own Christian convictions. I didn't really say anything about what I believed. Yet I was still able to convince him that he should abandon the idea of religious pluralism as an idea. And what was the only thing I did in that conversation? Tell me. I asked questions. That's right. Not just any question, but specific kinds of questions, such that as he answered the questions in his own mind, it was almost as if he was making his conclusions based on his own thoughts, even though it was me who was trying to evoke those questions in his mind and those answers. This is the habit I want you to get into, is learning how to use questions in order to be able to make your case about whatever conviction you want to communicate on. Now, in order to give you some context as to where this fits into our role as Christians, I want you to remember the fact that the Apostle Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 5:20 that we are all ambassadors for Christ. That means we represent Jesus Christ no matter what we do, no matter what we say, however we come across to other people, ultimately is a reflection upon the good name of Jesus. And that's why we want to make sure we ask the question, what kind of an ambassador am I like? Am I a good one, an effective one? Or am I crass, harsh, and offensive to everybody? Because ultimately, regardless of whether good or bad, we say something about our sovereign, who we represent. Now, at Stand to Reason where I work, we teach that there's 3 essential skills to being a good ambassador. The first is you have to have knowledge. The second is you have to have wisdom. And the third is character. And by knowledge, I simply mean that, look, as Christians, we have to have knowledge of the truth, God's message, the plan, what Scripture says. Also, we want to have knowledge of the false ideas that are raised up against the knowledge of the truth. So we have to have knowledge, but you realize that simply knowing things isn't going to be enough. We have to be able to take that knowledge and package it in a way that can be deployed in a persuasive yet clear manner. And that's where wisdom comes in, an artful method. But you probably also realize that if you just had knowledge and you just had wisdom, but you were a jerk when you spoke to people, well then of course your poor character would completely undermine your message. And that's why character, an attractive manner, is a third requirement for being an effective ambassador. Okay? Now, what we're going to be talking about this afternoon is the wisdom portion of that. How to be able to take what you know and deploy it in a persuasive and clear way. And that's what tactics have to do with. Now, there's a number of different benefits that come with learning these tactics, especially the tactic of using questions. And one of the benefits is that it'll allow you to present the truth in a very clear and clever way. But more importantly, learning tactics, especially the art of conversational persuasion with regards to questions, will allow you to choreograph your interactions. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. If you think about a choreographer with regards to, say, like dancing, my wife did ballet for many, many years, and often a choreographer has in their mind exactly what they want a dancer to do on stage. And so they already have it all planned out in their mind, what they want to see happen. And so they tell the dancer how to do that. And so maybe in the mind of the choreographer, they want the dancer to start maybe on this part of the stage, and then run across the stage. I don't do ballet, but do a jump, do a twirl, do something, and then end up over here at this part of the stage. All right? Now, in the same way, if you learn these tactics, you can also choreograph your interactions. Indeed, that's what I did with my friend Raj, who I just described to you at the very beginning. Notice, as soon as I realized he was a Hindu, I already knew in my mind where I wanted to go in that conversation. I already kind of had it thought out because I knew something about Hinduism. And I was banking on the fact that he was probably a religious pluralist. So what did I do? I asked a question that brought our conversation here. Then I asked another question that brought our conversation here. And then another one here, and another one here, until we got to this point where now my friend Raj was faced with the question, would you believe in this religion that teaches about a God on the far side of the moon? Because I knew that this would be a problem for his view about religious pluralism. And so I used questions to guide our conversation over here. Okay? So this is some of the benefits that come with learning these tactics. It will allow you to choreograph your interactions. Now, having said that, there's also a warning that comes with that, because you probably are thinking to yourself right now, maybe, man, Alan, what kind of power trip are you on? You know, what kind of sick person are you? Or do you want to manipulate people and trick them into bringing them into thinking these ideas? Well, the reality is, I'm not trying to trick anybody. I didn't do anything inappropriate in that conversation. I simply used the power of questions in order to guide the conversation, because I want to guide people graciously to the truth. And of course, questions allow you to do that. But as you probably realize, these tactics can become extremely powerful, and they can be quite easily abused. But please, if you're using these tactics because this meets some sort of sick, sense in which you want to be able to control or manipulate people or corner them or make them feel stupid, this is not the goal of tactics. Then you are not engaging in a way that is honorable in the name of Jesus Christ. So please don't use tactics for the purposes of belittling people or using them as kind of clever sophistry. That's not their goal. The goal is to guide people gently to the truth while remaining gracious and charitable. Now, having said that, I want to ask you a question. When you think about sharing your faith, any aspect of your convictions, or maybe some public policy issue that you want to talk about, and let's just say you're talking to an atheist who maybe doesn't share anything that you believe in, how would you rate yourself? Would you say you're a number one, you're like, yes, I relish the encounter, bring it on, I love talking to people who disagree with me? Would you say you're a number two, you're like, well, I'm willing, but frankly, I'm sometimes nervous, uncertain, or scared? Or would you say you're a three, you're like, I run the other way? Now, I'm curious, with a show of hands, raise your hand if you're a number one. Okay, we got maybe about 5% or so of the audience. Okay, raise your hand if you're number two. You're willing. Okay, it looks like the majority of you. Raise your hand if you're number three. You run the other way. Don't be shy. Okay. How many won't raise their hand no matter what I ask them? A few of you won't do that. Okay, got it. All right, so I'm going to do a little bit of an interactive here, but for those of you who raised your hand for two or three, tell me, what are some of the concerns you have with why you're nervous, uncertain, scared, or try to avoid it? Anybody, just raise your hand and I'll come to you. Yes? Okay, you feel like you're not knowledgeable enough. Maybe you don't know enough about the questions that they're asking or about the topic that you want to speak on. Okay, that's a real concern. What else? Yes, sir? Okay, you're afraid of rejection. You don't want to say something and have the person say, that's ridiculous. You believe in talking snakes? Come on, that's so stupid. Okay, absolutely. Yes? You might lose your job? Yes, absolutely. Maybe you work in a place where it's not allowed to share your faith, and that's going to be a real concern as well. Yes? Okay, yeah, maybe you start a conversation and there isn't enough time to address what you really want to address, and so you feel constrained by that. Absolutely. Good. What else? Anything else that comes to mind? Yes, sir? You can get shot at. Okay. So I'm curious as to where you're doing this, but let's just leave that alone for now. Okay, yes, physical threats. Of course, you might be concerned about that. So these are all legitimate concerns. Now, by the way, when I evaluate myself on this scale as well, I would put myself on a number 2. Now, keep in mind, I get invited to speak at secular universities and stand up on a university stage in front of a university audience and present wildly unpopular views like the pro-life position or the biblical view on homosexuality. And then they line up 2 microphones in the audience, and anyone can come up onto the microphone and debate me. And after they're done, they sit down, and another person comes up. And we do this for an hour. Okay? So now, do I relish that encounter? No! I'm willing, but I'm nervous, uncertain, or scared. And sometimes I try to avoid it, frankly. Okay? That's not fun for me. So the problem isn't so much that we have these concerns that all of you brought up and that I also share myself. The problem is when those concerns paralyze us from ever wanting to engage in conversation with another person who might not share our convictions. And my suggestion to you is, if you learn good tactics, they will give you the confidence to be able to share your convictions and respond to challenges against your faith in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have if you didn't know these tactics. And this tactic that I want to first teach you right now that is, I think, so powerful is known as the Columbo tactic. Now, how many of you have ever seen the TV show Columbo? Oh, bless your hearts. Well, okay, this is a fantastic show if you haven't seen it. But long story short, Lieutenant Columbo, played by the actor Peter Falk, comes onto a crime scene in virtually every episode. And he looks completely inept, right? It looks like his trench coat is something he slept in, right? He's got bedhead. He's not like gnawing on this piece of his cigar. It's not even lit. He takes out a piece of paper to take notes of the crime scene. He doesn't even have a pencil. It's like, hey, anybody got a pencil or something to write with? He looks completely inept at his ability to perform his job. Yet there's a secret to Columbo's success, and that is that he comes across as unassuming and very unthreatening, but yet he asks the question of the suspects in the room. And then he asks another question, and then another question, and another question. And he just questions them to death. And just by simply asking these innocuous, disarming questions, he's eventually able to figure out who it is that's the true criminal who's guilty of the crime. And that is the basis for why we call this the Columbo tactic, okay? Because at its very core, it's about using questions instead of statements in order to be able to make your point or respond to an objection, and then to be able to move forward in a conversation. And by the way, this tactic really is the easiest and yet the most powerful tactic that you can use in conversation. And you can use it with anyone, with your friends, whether believers or not believers, with any political party, on any subject matter, on theology. You can use it with your spouse, which I, by the way, warn you, be careful about that. When I start using this tactic with my wife, she's like, don't use your apologetics on me. You know, it's like, I'm your wife. But nevertheless, it's simply foundational principles of thinking and persuasion, and that's why it works, okay? Now, what are some of the benefits of asking questions? I'm sure many of you have been involved in good conversations. What are some of the benefits of using questions in conversations? What comes to mind? Okay, yeah, questions are engaging. Okay, so it engages a person in their mind. Yes, what else, sir?
You have control of the conversation.
Yes, it allows you to have control. When you ask a question, you're controlling the direction of the conversation, at least to a large extent, and that can be very, very powerful. Good. Yes, what else, ma'am? Yes, good point. Questions don't paint people into a corner, make them feel trapped. They're kind of open-ended. You're asking a question about a person, hey, what do you think about this? And they're telling you. You're not saying what their view is. You're letting them kind of express who they really are or whatever their views are. Absolutely. You want to go 2 for 2, sir? That's right. You inevitably learn a lot about the person you're talking to. So asking questions gives you information about the other person and their views, which allows you then to be able to respond appropriately to what they're saying rather than a view that they don't actually hold. Okay? So there's all these benefits of asking questions. In fact, Francis Schaeffer, who was a well-known philosopher back in the 20th century, I would argue he was just as famous as C.S. Lewis in sort of his realm of thinking and theology, which was philosophy. But he was a master at encouraging people to talk and him be able to share his faith with other people. And so he was just fantastic at this. But listen to what he says about the power of questions. He says, if I have only 1 hour with someone, I'll spend the first 55 minutes asking questions and finding out what is troubling their heart and mind, and then the last 5 minutes, I will share something of the truth. Wow, that's amazing. A lot of us think, man, if we gave a homosexual 55 minutes out of an hour to share their story, that we would have squandered our time. Or if we allow a Muslim to share about their religion, about their faith, about their convictions out of 55 minutes out of that hour, a lot of us think, oh man, you squandered your time. How come you didn't say more? But Francis Schaeffer says, no, on the contrary. Go ahead, ask questions. Find out really where they're at so that when you do speak, you got something that addresses specifically where they're at, rather than saying something about maybe somewhere where they're not at, okay? And that's the power of questions. So there's really 2 applications to the Columbo tactic. I want to teach you both of them real quick here. The first is this. The first kind of Columbo question that I want you to learn is one that will help you to gain information, kind of like what the gentleman was saying here earlier, okay? And this first key question that I want you to memorize is this. What do you mean by that? Very simple. Anybody here could say that. It doesn't have to be the exact words. What do you mean by that? Any question that asks for more information about a person's view will work. What do you mean by that? Tell me more about that. Define for me that term. Okay? Tell me what you're thinking. Any of these questions or any of these kinds of questions will work to achieve the same goal, which is to gain information. Now think about this. This is a great question to ask in so many situations, because when I'm out on a college campus or I'm speaking to people who don't share my faith, I get all sorts of people responding in strange ways to my beliefs. But here's one comment that I hear quite often. All religions are basically the same. Kind of like my friend Raj was saying when I was talking to him. Now, when someone says this, I know that this statement is false. Now, I'm not an expert in world religions, but probably if you've done just a little bit of study about any world religions, you come to realize that religions are not the same. In fact, they contradict one another in fundamental ways. Now, when somebody says this, though, I don't jump off into this long discourse about how they're mistaken about the statement. Instead, I ask them a Columbo question. I say, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by they're all the same? Now, think about this. You don't know what they mean by that. By the word the same, they could mean that they think all religions lead to the same God. Or maybe they mean that all religions have the same moral code. Okay? You don't know what they mean by the same. And so by asking, well, what do you mean by that? They'll tell you, and then you can respond to specifically what their statement actually is and not a view that they don't hold. Take another example of a statement. The Bible isn't reliable. Oh man, I hear this all the time. Now again, I could give an hour lecture and longer if you wanted about why the Bible is reliable, but I don't when someone says this. Instead, my first response to them is, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by reliable? And again, you don't know what they mean. Maybe they mean the Bible isn't a reliable source of history. Or maybe they mean the Bible isn't scientifically accurate. Or maybe they mean the Bible hasn't been reliably transmitted for thousands of years, such that what the Apostle Paul wrote 2,000 years ago is exactly what we read in our scriptures today. You don't know what they mean. And so by asking the Columbo question, they'll tell you which of those three or something else that they mean, and then you can respond specifically to their actual beliefs rather than to a belief that they don't hold. I'm pro-choice. Again, we often think that people, when they say they're pro-choice, that this means that they're for all forms of abortion throughout all 9 months of pregnancy, and this is rarely the case. People's views are very nuanced, and many people who identify themselves as pro-choice might think that actually third trimester abortions are wrong, that abortion done for the sake of birth control, if you will, not that that's the right thing to do, but nevertheless, they'll say that they're also against that kind of abortion. And so they might be against perhaps 50% of all abortions that go on, even though they identify themselves as pro-choice. And so by asking, well, what do you mean by pro-choice? They'll explain it, and then you don't have to waste your time, say, talking about third trimester abortions. You can jump to, say, first trimester or second trimester if they've already shared with you their views. And again, asking the Columbo question will help you to figure that out. Evolution is a well-proven fact. Okay? Now, how many different definitions of evolution are there? Lots. Okay? I can definitely say there's at least 3. And so when somebody says this, look, I know a lot about evolution, but I don't respond initially. I ask them, what do you mean by evolution? Right? Because again, somebody could simply mean by evolution that they think change occurs over time. Well, if that's all they mean by evolution, well, then everything evolves on that definition, right? Our hairdos evolve over time, right? The clouds evolve, cities evolve. If you have kids with GPAs, their GPAs evolve, hopefully up and not down. I mean, everything evolves on that definition. Well, what about, now, Charles Darwin, in his book On the Origin of Species, in his first 5 chapters of that book, he advanced a form of evolution called the special theory of evolution. And this is what many scientists today call microevolution. And this is not really a controversial idea. It's just simply the idea that species can adapt to their environments. Okay? All right, big deal. So, for example, a lot of times you'll have, let's say you're sick, and your doctor prescribes to you antibiotics. What's the one rule they insist when you take antibiotics? That you make you finish them. That's right. The reason why your doctor says that is because if you don't finish your whole antibiotic course, then some of the bacteria that's making you sick might survive and adapt to the antibiotics, become resistant to it. Then the bacteria grow again, make you sick, and then when you take the rest of your antibiotics, they don't work because the bacteria have evolved and developed a resistance to that antibiotics. Is that controversial? No. We see that happen before our eyes, if you will. I mean, it happens within our lifetime. So this is not a controversial concept behind evolution. So notice, two common definitions of evolution, we could wholeheartedly agree at this point with a person who says evolution is a well-proven fact, if they just meant by evolution either change over time or microevolution. Now, Darwin advanced a second definition of evolution called the general theory of evolution, and this is what many scientists refer now to as macroevolution, which is the idea that at one point in the history of the Earth, nothing was alive, a single-celled life form came to be by chance, and then from that single-celled life form, all of the plants and animals that we see on Earth today eventually evolved. Now, we have serious objections with that story, especially on a naturalistic, non-God kind of account. And so if that's what they mean by evolution, well, then we can now challenge them specifically with regards to their views. But notice, 2 out of those 3 definitions, we can wholeheartedly agree. That's why asking the Columbo question, what do you mean by that, will help you to sort through that quickly so you don't waste your time talking about things that don't necessarily matter, okay, or where you don't have a disagreement upon. And I won't go to this third one, but this last one, but same principle, okay? So notice, the question, what do you mean by that, can help you in so many ways to clarify what you're trying to figure out. Moreover, it can buy you some valuable time. A lot of times somebody might say to you, hey, the Bible isn't reliable. And all of a sudden you're freaked out. You're like, oh man, how do I respond to that? So you say, well, what do you mean by that? Now they're going to spend 5-10 minutes maybe explaining their view, and that can buy you some time. Give you a chance to kind of sort through your thoughts. Maybe they'll give you some more information in terms of their views that might trigger a thought as to how you can then respond. So there's all sorts of benefits to asking this question. But ultimately, it clarifies what a person believes so you don't misunderstand them and also so you don't misrepresent them. And in fact, does anybody know what it's called when you take someone's view, you misrepresent it in such a way that it's a lot easier to attack, and then you attack that view that they don't actually hold? Does anybody know what that's called? Yeah, straw man fallacy. And the name straw man fallacy gets its name for the idea that it's a lot easier to knock down a man made of straw than it is to knock down a real man, like our former governor, the governator, right? Right? Think about that. If you had the choice to have to try to either knock down a man made of straw or Arnold Schwarzenegger today, what would be easier? Well, maybe it would be Arnold because he's a lot weaker now and more flabby and whatever. But apart from that, when he was in his prime, it would have been a lot harder, right? Look at this guy's man made of like solid rock, if you will. And so if you take a real human being and misrepresent him in such a way that he's a lot easier to knock down, well, you're committing a straw man. You're not attacking the real thing. Using the Columbo tactic will help you to avoid making this very embarrassing mistake, because you'll ask a person, what do they actually believe? They'll tell you, and then you'll respond to their actual view, not to a view that they don't hold. So that's the first kind of application of the Columbo tactic. This first application tells you what a person thinks. But I want to give you a second question that'll help you as well. And this second question will do something else. It'll help you to reverse the burden of proof. It'll tell you why they believe what they believe. Okay? So the first Columbo tactic tells you what they believe. The second Columbo question will tell you why they believe it, and it'll help you to reverse the burden of proof. Now, before we define burden of proof, we have to first define what an argument is. Does anybody have a rough definition of an argument? There's really 2 components to this definition. But does anybody want to take a stab at how you would define an argument? Disagreement, you said? Okay, yeah, so you definitely have to have a person who has a point of view, but in reality, you don't even have to have an opposing point of view to be able to present an argument. Yes?
A claim with proof.
Very good. An argument is simply a claim with proof. That's exactly what it is. So it's a claim with proof or reasons to back it up, right? So when I get home tonight, my wife might ask me, Alan, hey, what should we do for dinner? And I say to her, let's go to Taco Bell. Okay, now at that point, I've simply made a claim. We should go to Taco Bell. Now, her being the health nut that she is, she'll be like, what are you talking about? Why would we go to Taco Bell? Her question, why should we go to Taco Bell, is asking me for number 2, which is a reason to back up my claim. So I tell her, well, it's, Taco Tuesday. Wait, it's not Tuesday. Well, whatever. Let's pretend it was Tuesday. It's Taco Tuesday. Get 2 tacos for $1. Okay? So I've given her a reason. My reason is we get a discount. I've just then presented an argument. Notice, there's no bickering, there's no fighting, there's no yelling. It doesn't even have to have disagreement. An argument is simply your point of view, your claim, with evidence or reasons to back it up. Okay? In fact, oftentimes, people in logic or philosophy use a house as an analogy. They say, look, an argument's like a house. You have the roof, which is like your opinion or your claim or your conclusion, and the walls of that house are the reasons. The walls are what hold up your roof, your claim, your belief. Okay? So, with that in mind, an argument is simply a point of view with evidence or reasons to back it up. Now, the question becomes, what is the burden of proof? And does anybody who might be involved in the legal profession might know what the burden of proof is? I'm going to take a stab at it. What is the burden of proof? It's often used in court cases. Okay, so I heard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, that is part of what goes on in a court case kind of system. But the burden of proof is simply the responsibility someone has to give evidence or reasons for their view. Okay? And here's how that rule works. Whoever makes the claim, it's their job to bear the burden of proof. Whoever offers their opinion, whoever makes a statement, it's their job, it's their responsibility to provide evidence for their view. So, for example, if you're talking to somebody and they say, all religions are basically the same, who's made the claim, you or them? Them. So whose job is it to bear the burden of proof, you or them? Them. Okay? Now, if you say, hey, I think God is real, or Jesus died for your sins, or Jesus rose from the dead, now who's made the claim, you or them? You. So who bears the burden of proof? You do. Okay? Now, having said that, I want to tell you the most common mistake I see Christians make in conversations with people who don't share their views. They give people what I call a free ride, and this is what it looks like. They'll be talking to a person who doesn't share their faith convictions, perhaps, maybe they're not a Christian, and the person will say, well, all religions are basically the same. Okay? So they've just made an opinion. They just offered a claim, but they haven't given evidence for their view. So it's not an argument. So all religions are basically the same. The Christian, in response, defends against an opinion. They say, no, that's not true. All religions are not the same. In fact, I've studied Islam, teaches that Jesus is just a prophet, and Judaism teaches he's not a prophet, and Christianity teaches that he's the Son of God. So they contradict one another, and the Christian goes off giving a free ride. They go off spending 5 minutes defending against another person's opinion. Brothers and sisters, you do not have to do that. That is a free ride. If you feel the obligation to defend against every person's opinion, you will not want to share your faith because you'll feel you're obligated to respond to every wild story and objection that people can spin. Trust me, there's all sorts of crazy ideas and objections raised against the Christian worldview, but most of them, or I should say all of them, aren't true. The problem is that we often think that it's our responsibility to respond to every person's opinion when they haven't even made an argument for their view. Please don't do that. If I felt obligated to respond to every person's opinion, to their claim, to their point of view, without any evidence for them backing it up, I too would not want to share my faith. Because I'd have to respond to every wacky claim that people can spin. And so that's why I'm saying don't give people a free ride. Instead, when someone makes a claim or they raise an objection, simply make them bear the burden of proof. This isn't a trick. This isn't clever sophistry. It's the appropriate thing to do. Challenge them to give reasons for their view. And so here's the question you want to ask. How did you come to that conclusion? Just as easy as the first Columbo question. How did you come to that conclusion? Or why should I believe what you just said? Very powerful, very easy. So, for example, people say to me all the time, the Bible's been translated and retranslated so many times, you can't possibly know that what the Apostle Paul wrote 2,000 years ago is what you're reading in your Bibles today. Okay? Now, again, I could give an hour lecture as to why they're mistaken, but I don't. I make my job 10 times easier by simply saying, how did you come to that conclusion? Why should I believe what you just said? That statement is not an argument. It's just an opinion. They just offered you a roof without walls. Don't mistake it for a house. People say to me, Jesus taught reincarnation after traveling to India. Really? Why should I believe that? You don't have to respond to this. You don't have to be a first century scholar. You don't have to be a historian. All you got to simply know is Columbo. Why should I think that's true? Again, this is not a trick. This is not for you to avoid your responsibility. It's an appropriate thing to ask them to give evidence or reasons for their views. The universe came into existence by itself. Really? Do you have any evidence why that could be true? That's an incredible claim. All religions are based the same. What makes you think that? The Bible is full of fables and myths. Can you prove to me how you know that? Every living thing came from a single-cell life form. What reasons do you have for believing that's the case? Science has proven the Bible wrong. How did you come to that conclusion? Now again, notice, this question also has all the same benefits of the previous question. It shows interest in their view, it's engaging, but most importantly, it puts the burden of proof back on the other person where the burden belongs. Every single one of these statements is not an argument. It's just an opinion, and you are not obligated to respond to opinions. The only thing you should say to a person's opinion is, interesting opinion. Could you tell me why you think that's true? Again, it's not a trick. If you said something about your faith, they would demand the same thing of you, by the way. Now, it's important to keep in mind also that sometimes, before I make this other point here, let me just take a look at some of these examples that we see quite often in the public square. These are all things that are said to me in college, university settings, or just kind of in the public square, right? So let's just as a group kind of go through this. All species emerged by evolution. Now, what is the one Columbo question you can ask that reverses the burden of proof to this opinion? Yeah, how do you know that's true? Or what did you say? Why do you think that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? Any one of those questions would be just fine for that particular statement. Because again, that statement is not an argument, it's just an opinion. Denying same-sex marriage is like denying interracial marriage. Okay? Now, you might be tempted to go off on some historical argument as to why these are different and all that, but instead, the appropriate thing to do initially when somebody says this is to reverse the burden of proof. Okay? Make them shoulder the burden of proof because they're the ones who made the claim. It's their job to bear the burden. So what question could you ask them? Okay, good question. So this is actually a point I was going to bring up, so we'll take this here. But the point is so how do you keep the conversation going if they can't back up their opinion, right? Oftentimes you're right. I'll ask somebody, well, you just made the claim that denying same-sex marriage is just like denying interracial marriage. Could you tell me how you know that's true? Now, what often happens is you get a blank stare because they're not used to Christians not taking the bait. Usually the Christians will take the bait and try to defend against this person's opinion. And so these people can just throw a lob after lob, all these opinions, which sound like really hard arguments. In reality, they're not arguments, they're just opinions. And so people kind of be like, well, I don't know. I mean, that's what I read on the internet. It's like, well, do you believe everything you read on the internet? I mean, come on. So oftentimes they won't know what to say, and you don't want to then beat them over the head with that and continue to embarrass them. Just be like, okay, so you don't really have any, and try to say this in the most gracious way possible. So basically you're saying you don't have any reasons as to why you think this is true. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that's clear, But oftentimes you're right. A lot of times they won't know what to say because they're not used to Christians just being like, I don't know how to respond to this. I'm going to try to defend it, and I'm going to try to give them a free ride, But bottom line, with denying same-sex marriage is just like denying interracial marriage. Your key question again is, how did you come to that conclusion? Okay. How about this? God can't exist if evil and suffering exist. What Columbo question could you ask that reverses the burden of proof? Yes. How did you come to that conclusion? That's the correct answer. All right. Muhammad was a prophet of God. What question could you ask that reverses the burden of proof? How did you come to that conclusion? That's right. You see a pattern here? Homosexuality is the same as heterosexuality. How did you come to that conclusion? By the way, people do say that, The Bible's uncorrupted. How did you come to that conclusion? That's right. Women will die in back alleys. Muslims and Christians worship the same God. All of these are simply opinions. They are not arguments. Please don't treat them as such. Make them shoulder the burden of proof. They're making the claim. It's their job to back up their views, not your job to defend against every person's opinion. All right? Keep that in mind. Otherwise, it's the biggest mistake we make in most conversations. Now, what I was going to say was, we just want to be careful of what's called a professor's ploy. And this is a situation which Happens, by the way, in everyday conversation, although I'll give you the illustration as in a university setting. But sometimes you'll have a professor teaching about U.S. history or something like that, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, that professor starts attacking the Bible. The Bible's full of fables and myths. You can't trust it. And if there's a Christian student in the classroom, they're like, where is this coming from? So the student will raise his hand, and the professor, yes, sir. And the student will say, and they use their tactics. They'll say, well, professor, you just made the claim the Bible is full of fables and myths. Could you give us some reasons why you believe that to be true? So notice the student is appropriately asking the professor to bear the burden of proof. Now, the professor, though, is smart. They've had lots of Christians come and go through their classroom, and so here's what the professor says. Listen, I'm an open-minded kind of guy. I'm willing to consider other people's viewpoints and other people's beliefs. So, sir, why don't you go ahead and share and tell us why you think the Bible's true and trustworthy and reliable? Now, what's the professor just done? Yeah, he just put the burden of proof back on the student. Is that where it belongs? No. And so the student should not take the bait. Instead, the student should say, well, wait a minute, professor. I didn't say anything. You're the teacher. We're the students. We're learning from you. You made the claim. It's your job to bear the burden of proof and tell us why you believe what you said is true. Or should we just take everything you say on faith? No, don't say that. That's what I'd like to say, right? But oftentimes this happens in conversations as well. You're talking to somebody and they'll say, well, all religions are based the same. And you're saying, well, how did you come to that conclusion? Well, you're telling me that Christianity is the only true religion? Prove it. Like, well, wait a minute. I didn't make any statement. I'm just asking you to defend your view. So oftentimes this gets turned around back on you as well. Just keep that in mind, and that's why I wanted you to take note of that. So remember, there are two questions. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? The first question, what do you mean by that, tells you what a person thinks. The second kind of question, how did you come to that conclusion, tells you why a person thinks that. Now, it could be the case, though, that you say, well, how did you come to that conclusion that you think evolution's true? And all of a sudden, it turns out you realize you're talking to like a Harvard geneticist, and they're all, I'll tell you why. And they give you some like genetics argument you've never heard of. Now, here's what happens when they actually do give you evidence for their view, and now they've made a bona fide argument. And here's what I do. I say, hey, you know what? That's an interesting argument. I've never heard that before. Hey, can I get back to you on that? Can I think about that and get back to you on that later? You go home, you go to our website, str.org, or whatever, Frank Turk's website, or whoever you want to get the answer. Do your research, figure out the answer, and when you go see your cousin or your friend or whoever it is you were just talking to, your classmate, you say to them, hey, I was thinking about what you said about that genetics argument, and I discovered that so-and-so is true, or such and such is true, or whatever. And so then you go ahead and respond. And if you do this enough times, eventually you'll start to get familiar with all the kinds of objections that people raise against the Christian worldview. And by the way, they repeat themselves, okay? Just a tip. So it'll actually help you to become more and more prepared. Whenever you don't know how to respond, just say, hey, good, interesting point. I've never heard that. Go back and research it. Get the answer, go back and come back to them the next time you see them and say, hey, I was thinking about what you said, and it occurred to me that, and they can respond, okay? A couple closing thoughts here in terms of how to just prepare yourselves for this. I live near Camp Pendleton, which, as many of you know, is a Marine Corps base. A lot of my friends say, who are the Marine Corps, they say, hey, the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in battle. In other words, the more you practice this stuff, the better you get at it. Most Christians, when they first try to use the Columbo tactic, are still tempted to want to respond every time they hear any objection against the Christian worldview. And you've got to get out of the habit of always speaking. Instead, ask a question. Hey, tell me more about that. How did you come to that conclusion? Make them give you an argument first before you respond. If they don't, just be like, hey, you know what? It's an interesting opinion, I'm glad you shared that, but it doesn't sound like you have much to go on in terms of why you believe that's true. You don't have to be, snarky and mean about it, but just maybe you want to have to point that out at some point. Second of all, don't be discouraged by outward appearances. You don't realize how the Holy Spirit could be using your interaction in a way that's kind of going on behind the scenes where you can't see what's going on in their heart and soul. So don't feel like, oh man, nothing happened here. They didn't change their minds. It's okay. You don't know what's going on. Don't make a judgment about what's going on just by outward appearances. Third, don't be compelled necessarily to present the gospel in every situation. You know, a lot of times Christians will be talking and maybe the subject of morality or the Bible will come up, and then we're just so like eager to try to turn the conversation and bring it right into the gospel and force it kind of, shoehorn the gospel into any conversation. You know, you're talking about like, the person, you see a car and your friend got new tires on his car. You're like, oh, you got new tires in your car? Yeah, man, pretty awesome. Well, what did you get? Bridgestone. How did you decide about that? Because I think you should also decide about Jesus Christ, who you need to believe in right now. It's like, the guy's like, what in the world is that? I was like, where did that come from? Look, don't feel you got to shoehorn the gospel into every conversation. Don't get me wrong. If the opportunity arises, by all means, present the gospel. Of course, I'm not against that. I'm just simply saying, don't force it every single time because your friends get really annoyed by that. And eventually they kind of like become more and more resistant and the walls go up, all right? Instead, make a more modest goal. And that goal is to put a stone in your shoe, right? You know when you get a stone in your shoe, every time you walk, you're kind of reminded by that stone that's really annoying the heel of your foot, okay? In the same way, we want to give them something to think about, okay? Give them some things to think about so that as they walk away, the Holy Spirit can use that to convict them of whatever idea that you were trying to persuade them of, all right? And finally, I like what Mother Teresa says. I'm not Catholic, but nevertheless, I like what she says here. She says, look, God has not called me to be successful. He's called me to be faithful, okay? Realize your job ends after you present the truth or the gospel or whatever it is in a winsome, persuasive, and gracious way. And then you leave the results up to God, okay? Don't be committed to the end result. Your job is not to convert people. Your job is not to convince people of your great ideas and arguments. Your job is to be a faithful ambassador for Jesus and present whatever you're saying in a truthful, compassionate, persuasive, winsome, and gracious way. And then you leave the results up to God. Indeed, I would argue that if you do that, if you do your end of the bargain, present the truth as an ambassador, and the person completely rejects you, I would still say you succeeded 100%. Because the results are up to God. You leave Him dealing with the person's heart or their repentance, okay? Now, before I go, I just want to make mention of one thing here. This book, Tactics, which we are selling in the bookstore area, we have a small booth called Stand to Reason. If you are interested in learning all the other tactics, I just taught you part of one tactic. We got about 7 more tactics in this book. If you want to learn these tactics, they're very powerful. They can be used in the art of conversational persuasion on any subject, whether you're talking about abortion or same-sex marriage or revolution or some matter of theology. These tactics apply to every situation because they're just the tools of persuasion. So I encourage you to pick up that book. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you over in the bookstore, all right?